They called her an Apache girl before the dust even settled beneath her boots. And in a town like Red Creek, that was enough to decide the rest of her story before she ever spoke a word. The wind dragging long ribbons of sand across the main street as she stood there with nothing but a worn dress and steady eyes that did not beg and did not break, while men on the porch leaned back in their chairs, hats tipped low, watching the way her shadow stretched thin across the boards as if even the sun wasn't sure where she belonged. And somewhere behind them a screen door creaked once then fell still, like the whole town had decided to hold its breath at the same time. Because people out here didn't need proof, they needed patterns, and her dark hair, her quiet stance, the way she carried herself like she owed nothing to anyone, it all fit too easily into a story they had told themselves 100 times before. So someone muttered it first, low and careless, Apache girl, and the word moved. Faster than the wind, passing from one mouth to another until it settled on her shoulders like dust that wouldn't shake loose. And she heard it. Of course she did. But she didn't turn, didn't argue, didn't even slow her steps as she walked the length of that street, boots scuffing soft against dry earth, the faint jingle of a loose spur somewhere behind her marking time like a clock that had stopped caring. And a boy near the hitching post pointed just long enough for his mother to pull his hand down, not in correction but in agreement, because that's how things worked here. Quiet signals, small gestures, a whole judgment passed without needing to be spoken aloud again. And when she reached the water trough at the far end of the street, she paused, just for a second, fingers brushing the edge of the worn wood, as if testing something only she could feel. And from where he stood across the road, Caleb Thornfield watched that moment longer than he meant to. Watched the way her shoulders stayed level, the way her breathing never changed, like she had walked through worse storms than this and learned long ago that reacting only fed the fire. And he noticed something else too, something small and easy to miss, the faint outline beneath the fabric near her collar, like she was carrying something close, something hidden, not heavy enough to weigh her down, but important enough that she never let it drift far. And that detail stayed with him longer than the whispers did, because out here, people lied with their mouths but told the truth with what they chose to carry, and still the town kept watching, measuring, deciding, until a man near the saloon finally spoke louder than the rest, voice dry as the land itself, saying there was no place for her kind here, and the others didn't argue, didn't need to. Their silence did the work for them, pressing in from all sides without ever raising a hand. And through it all she stood there, one figure against a town that had already made up its mind, her gaze lifting just once, not to challenge them, not to plead, but to see them clearly, as if memorizing something she already understood too well. And in that quiet space between judgment and truth, something unseen shifted, like the first crack in wood before it splits, and Caleb felt it before anyone else did, not as a warning, but as a question the town wasn't ready to answer yet. The town did not move on from her presence the way it usually did with strangers. Instead it settled into a slower rhythm, like a clock that had lost a second somewhere and could not quite catch up. Conversations shortening when she passed, glances stretching just a little too long, and even the horses tied along the rail seemed to shift uneasily, as if they felt the weight of something unspoken pressing down on the street. And by late afternoon the sun had dipped low enough to cast everything in a copper glow that made edges softer but truths sharper. And it was in that light that the first real trouble began to take shape. Not loud, not sudden, but quiet in the way a rumor builds before it finds its voice. Because someone noticed the back door of Miller's supply barn had been left unlatched, and someone else remembered seeing a figure walking that direction earlier. And it did not take long for those small pieces to arrange themselves into something that looked like certainty, even if no one could say exactly when. They had decided it was true, and by the time the words reached the center of town they carried the weight of fact. A missing lock, a shadow in the wrong place, a stranger with the wrong face. And the conclusion formed as naturally as dust settling after a passing horse. And all the while she remained near the trough, not hiding, not leaving, as if she had nowhere else to go, or perhaps nowhere she needed to be. Her reflection faint in the water that trembled with each gust of wind. And when the first man approached her, boots slow and deliberate, there was no anger in his step, only the quiet authority of someone who believed he already knew the answer to a question he had not yet asked. and behind him others followed, not close enough to crowd, but near enough to witness, to confirm, to be part of whatever came next without having to take responsibility for starting it. And Caleb watched from across the road again. His weight shifted slightly against the post beside him, his gaze not fixed on the men but on her, because it was her stillness that did not fit, the way she did not brace, did not retreat, did not offer explanations that no one had requested. And when the man finally spoke, asking where she had been an hour ago, the question landed in the air between them like something heavier than its words, and she answered simply, her voice low but steady, saying she had been walking, and that answer should have ended it. But it did not, because it did not satisfy the shape of the story they had already built. And someone behind the man added that things had gone missing, and another voice followed, softer but sharper, saying that strangers did not arrive empty-handed and stay that way for long. And the circle tightened not in distance but in certainty, and still she did not argue, did not defend herself with the urgency they expected, only lifted her gaze again, meeting each face in turn as if giving them a chance to see something different, something beyond the outline they had drawn around her. But most of them looked past her instead, at the idea of her, and that was when Caleb finally pushed himself off the post and stepped forward, not quickly, not in challenge, but with the same measured pace he used when approaching a skittish horse. And he stopped just far enough to keep space between them all, his eyes moving from the man asking questions to the girl who was not answering in the way they wanted. And he said nothing at first, because silence had a way of revealing more than words ever could. And in that silence he noticed the smallest shift, the edge of fabric near her collar pulling slightly, as if something beneath it had caught on the light. And for a brief second, no longer than a blink, there was the faintest glint of metal hidden there, something shaped not like decoration but like purpose, and it was gone as quickly as it appeared, lost again beneath cloth and shadow. But it stayed in his mind, steady and unresolved, like a detail that did not belong in the story being told. And when he finally spoke, his voice did not accuse or defend. It only asked why no one had checked the barn themselves before deciding who to blame. And the question did not break the tension, but it bent it, just enough to create a crack where doubt could slip through. And in that narrow space, something began to shift again, slow and uncertain, like the town realizing for the first time that certainty might not be as solid as it had felt a moment before. The crack that Caleb's question opened did not shatter the moment, but it lingered there, thin and fragile, like ice over shallow water that might hold or might give way depending on who stepped first. And for a brief second no one spoke, the kind of silence that carries weight instead of absence, until the man nearest the barn cleared his throat and shifted his stance, as if the ground beneath him had become less certain, though his voice when it came out still carried the same confidence, saying the latch had been loose, and that was reason enough. But even he did not sound as convinced as he had moments before, and the others behind him exchanged glances not of agreement, but of hesitation, small flickers of doubt passing between them, like shadows moving across a wall at sunset. And through it all she remained where she stood, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady, her eyes not defiant but unwavering, as if she had seen this pattern before and understood that speaking too soon would only feed what had already been decided. And Caleb noticed that too, the discipline in her stillness, the way she allowed the moment to stretch without trying to control it, like someone who knew that truth did not need to rush. And it was then that a boy's voice cut through the quiet again, the same boy from earlier, stepping forward just enough to be heard, saying he had seen something else near the barn, not her this time, but a wagon, one that did not belong to anyone in town, and the detail hung there awkwardly, unexpected, because it did not fit the story they had already begun to believe. And the man who had first spoken frowned slightly, turning toward the boy as if trying to measure the weight of his words against the version of events he preferred. And for the first time the circle loosened, not physically, but in the way certainty no longer held it together as tightly as before. And Caleb took a slow breath, his eyes drifting once more to the girl. And again that small detail pulled at his attention, the faint shape beneath her collar shifting as the wind brushed against her. And this time the light caught it just enough for him to see the edge of something solid, something crafted, not a trinket, not decoration, but a piece of metal worn close. and he did not know why it mattered yet. Only that it did, in the quiet way certain truths make themselves known before they are understood. And across from him she seemed to sense the shift as well, not in the crowd, but in the space around her, her gaze lowering for just a moment as her fingers brushed near her collar, a subtle movement, almost instinctive, as if confirming that what she carried was still there, still hidden, still hers. And when she looked up again, there was something different in her eyes, not fear, not relief, but a quiet decision settling into place, and the man at the front noticed it too, though he could not name it, and that uncertainty made him speak again, louder this time, asking her directly what she was hiding, the words sharper now, not because he knew, but because he did not, and the question shifted the air once more, drawing every eye back to her, every assumption tightening into focus again, waiting for her to either confirm or deny what they had already decided. And for the first time since she had stepped into that town, she moved with intention, not stepping back, not stepping forward, but reaching slowly toward the edge of her collar, her fingers steady despite the weight of every gaze upon her. And Caleb felt the moment stretch thin again, thinner than before, like something about to give way completely, not with force, but with truth. And the wind quieted just enough for the faint sound of metal brushing fabric to carry across the space between them, small and precise. And in that sound there was a promise, not of conflict, but of revelation, something that would not match what they had expected, something that would not fit the name they had already given her. And for the first time since she arrived, the town did not feel certain at all. Her fingers closed around the edge of the fabric, and for a moment nothing else in the world seemed to move. Not the men, not the dust, not even the loose sign above the saloon that had been creaking all afternoon. And then slowly, with a calm that did not match the tension pressing in from every side, she pulled the hidden object free, the metal catching the last stretch of sunlight as it slipped into view. Not bright like jewelry meant to be admired, but worn in a way that suggested years of purpose, edges softened, surface marked by time and handling. And she did not raise it high, did not present it like proof or weapon, only held it where it could be seen, steady in her open palm. And for a second the crowd did not understand what they were looking at, because it did not fit the shape of the story they had already decided to believe, and confusion has a way of silencing even the loudest voices. And Caleb saw it first, the outline, the engraving, the unmistakable structure of a badge, not new, not polished, but real in a way that could not be mistaken once recognized. And his eyes narrowed slightly as memory reached for something just beyond grasp, while the man at the front took a hesitant step closer, squinting as if clarity might come with proximity, and someone behind him muttered that it could have been stolen, because doubt does not disappear easily. It reshapes itself to survive. But even that explanation lacked the weight it had before, and she watched them all without expression, not challenging, not pleading, simply allowing the truth to sit there between them, unadorned and undeniable. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried no urgency, only a quiet certainty that did not ask to be believed, saying the badge had belonged to a man who once kept order in a place not far from there, a man who believed that judgment should come after understanding, not before. And a few of the older men shifted at that, because the words sounded less like a defense and more like a reminder of something they had chosen to forget. And Caleb felt it settle into place then, the memory sharpening, the name forming without being spoken, a sheriff who had disappeared years ago under circumstances that no one had ever fully explained, a man whose absence had left more questions than answers. And he looked at her again, this time not as a stranger passing through, but as someone connected to a story that had been left unfinished. And the crowd followed that shift slowly, uncertain but drawn in despite themselves, because the badge in her hand carried a weight they could not easily dismiss. And still she did not move closer, did not use it to claim space or authority, only let it exist in the open, as if the truth did not need to be forced. And the wind picked up again, brushing loose strands of her hair across her face. And for the first time, there was something almost human in the way she reached up to tuck it back. A small gesture that broke the stillness just enough to remind them she was not an idea or a label, but a person standing in front of them. And the man who had first accused her hesitated now, his certainty worn thin, his voice lower when he spoke again. asking where she had gotten it. And the question no longer sounded like an accusation, but like someone trying to understand how the ground beneath them had shifted so quickly, and she met his gaze without hesitation, answering simply that it had never been lost, only carried. And that answer did not explain everything, but it explained enough to unravel the story they had built around her, thread by thread, until what remained looked nothing like what they had believed an hour before, and Caleb exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in recognition, because the truth had not arrived loudly, had not demanded attention. It had simply been revealed, quiet and steady, and in doing so it had exposed something far larger than a misunderstanding about one girl. It had shown the town itself reflected back through their own assumptions, and for a long moment no one spoke, not because they did not have words, but because none of them felt certain enough to use them anymore. The badge did not change her, it changed them, and that difference settled over the street like the first shade after a long day under the sun, subtle but undeniable, because moments ago they had seen only what they expected to see, and now they were forced to look again, this time without the comfort of certainty, and it made their posture shift, their voices lower, their eyes hesitate before meeting hers. And yet she had not moved from where she stood, not stepped forward to claim anything, not stepped back to escape it, only remained exactly where she had been when they decided who she was, as if proving that nothing about her had changed at all, only the way they chose to see her. And Caleb noticed that more than anything, the stillness of her stance, the way she refused to use the badge as leverage, because most men would have held it higher, demanded something with it, forced the moment into submission. But she did none of that, and that restraint carried more weight than any authority the metal could represent. And the man who had first spoken earlier now cleared his throat again, though this time the sound did not carry the same confidence. And he asked her name, not as a challenge, but as if the question had only just become necessary. And for a second the air held still again, waiting, because names have a way of reshaping everything that comes after them. And when she answered, her voice remained calm, steady, almost quiet against the shifting wind, saying, "Elena Crow," the words landing softly but echoing farther than any accusation had before, and that name moved through the crowd differently than the label they had given her, not sharp, not dismissive, but heavy with something they could not immediately place. And one of the older men near the edge of the group stepped forward slightly, his brow tightening as memory reached for something half forgotten. Because Crow was not a name that belonged to stories of outsiders or strangers, it belonged to something older, something tied to law and order, to a man who had once walked these roads not with judgment in his eyes but with patience. And that recognition did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a photograph developing in low light. And as it did, the distance between her and the town shifted again, not closing, but changing shape, no longer defined by suspicion, but by uncertainty. And still she did not explain further, did not offer details to fill the silence they had created, because the truth did not seem to require it. And Caleb felt something settle deeper inside him then, not about who she was, but about what she was choosing not to do, because silence in a moment like this was not weakness, it was control, it was understanding that the weight of realization carried farther when it was not pushed. And behind him someone muttered that a name and a badge did not explain the way she looked, and that question, quieter than before but still present, revealed the last thread of resistance holding the town together, the need to reconcile what they saw with what they now knew. And Elena turned her head slightly toward that voice, not sharply, not offended, but with the same steady composure she had carried from the beginning. And for the first time, there was something in her expression that felt almost like an answer before words were spoken, not defensive, not apologetic, just certain, as if she had heard that question more times than she could count. And when she finally spoke again, she did not raise the badge, did not justify her place. She only said that where she had been raised mattered more than how she looked, and the words did not challenge them. They simply existed, plain and unembellished. And yet they carried more force than any argument could have, because they shifted the question from what she was to who they were, and the town felt that shift whether they admitted it or not. The realization that their judgment had never been about truth, only about comfort, about fitting someone into a story that required no effort to understand. And now that story no longer held and in its place stood a person they did not yet know how to define, and Caleb exhaled slowly again, his gaze steady on her, because in that moment he understood something the others were still trying to grasp, that the badge had revealed a past, but her silence was revealing something far more difficult, something about choice, about identity that could not be assigned or taken away. And as the light faded further and the shadows stretched longer across the street, the town of Red Creek stood there, not facing a stranger anymore, but facing the quiet truth that they had never really seen her at all. The words she left behind did not fade when the wind picked up again. They stayed, settling into the spaces between people where certainty used to live, and for a long moment no one seemed willing to move first, as if any action might confirm something they were not ready to accept. And the street that had once felt narrow and controlled now stretched wide and uncertain under the fading light, the wooden boards creaking softly beneath shifting weight as men adjusted their stance without realizing it. And somewhere down the road a horse let out a low breath, the sound carrying farther than it should have in the quiet that followed. And Caleb remained where he stood, not stepping closer, not stepping back, his eyes steady on Elena, as if trying to understand not just what she had revealed, but what she had chosen not to say, because there was something deliberate in that absence, something that suggested her story was not missing pieces, but withholding them, and that difference mattered more than most would notice. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the man who had questioned her earlier lowered his gaze, not in defeat, but in recognition that the ground beneath his assumptions had shifted beyond repair, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge entirely, asking where she had come from before arriving here, the question softer now, stripped of accusation, and she answered after a brief pause, not immediately, not evasively, but with the kind of timing that suggested she understood the weight of each word before giving it, saying she had come from the North Ridge, from land that did not belong to towns or maps the way people here understood them. And that answer did not satisfy curiosity so much as it redirected it, because it did not fit neatly into any story they knew how to tell. And a few in the crowd exchanged uncertain glances again, their earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, something closer to humility, though none of them would have named it that. And Caleb felt that shift deepen, not as a sudden change, but as a slow turning, like a wheel that had been set in motion long before this moment, and was only now revealing its direction. And he took a step forward then, just one, enough to close the distance slightly without breaking the space she had claimed for herself. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm he had held from the beginning, asking not what she was or where she belonged, but whether she intended to stay. And the question hung differently than the others, not pressing, not judging, simply offering the possibility of choice. And Elena met his gaze fully for the first time, not guarded, not distant, but clear in a way that made the rest of the town seem slightly out of focus around them. And for a moment she did not answer, as if weighing something beyond the surface of the question. And then she looked past him, past the men, past the buildings that had defined this place long before she arrived. And there was something in that look that felt like both memory and decision at once. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained steady, but there was a quiet finality in it that had not been there before, saying that staying was not the same as belonging, and that she had learned long ago that places did not change just because someone chose to stand in them. And the words did not accuse, did not challenge. They simply acknowledged a truth that settled heavier than any argument could have, and the town felt it, not as rejection, but as reflection, the realization that what they had offered her had never been space, only judgment waiting to be confirmed or denied. And now that she had denied it without anger, without force, it left them with nothing to hold on to except the weight of their own actions. And Caleb understood that more clearly than the rest, the way she had given them a chance without ever asking for one, and how easily they had failed to see it. And he nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if recognizing something that did not need to be spoken aloud. And as the last light of the day slipped behind the distant ridge, casting the town into a softer shadow, the moment settled into something quieter, not resolved, not finished, but changed in a way that could not be undone. And for the first time since she had stepped onto that street, no one moved to stop her as she turned slightly, her hand closing once more around the badge before slipping it back beneath the fabric where it belonged. Hidden again not out of fear, but out of choice, and in that small, deliberate motion, the final shape of the moment revealed itself, not as a victory, not as a loss, but as something far rarer, a truth seen clearly enough that it no longer needed to be argued. She did not rush when she turned away from them, and that was the part that stayed with Caleb long after the moment should have ended, the absence of urgency, the quiet certainty in each step as her boots pressed into the dust like she had already decided where she belonged long before this town ever tried to tell her otherwise. And the street did not stop her, did not call her back, not because they had suddenly become kinder, but because something inside them no longer knew how to justify holding her there. And that silence followed her the way shadows follow a rider at sunset, stretching long and thin behind her as she moved toward the far edge of Red Creek, past the trough, past the hitching posts, past the last building where the wood gave way to open land. And still no one spoke, not even the ones who had been loudest before, because the words they had used no longer fit the shape of what they had seen. And when words lose their place, people are left with nothing but themselves. And that is a harder thing to face than any stranger passing through. And Caleb stood there a moment longer, watching the distance between her and the town grow, not in steps, but in meaning. And then he moved, not quickly, not with intention to stop her, but with the same steady pace he had carried from the beginning, his boots finding the same path she had just taken, though he kept enough space to make it clear he was not following her, only walking in the same direction for reasons that belonged to him. And the wind had shifted again by the time he reached the edge of town, cooler now, carrying the scent of open land and distant sage, and she had slowed just slightly, not because she was unsure, but because the land itself seemed to invite a different kind of movement, less bound by the weight of watching eyes. And when he came close enough for his presence to be known without intruding, he spoke, not asking her to stay, not offering apology on behalf of others, only saying that towns like this remembered slowly, but they did remember, and the words hung there between them, not as promise, but as something closer to possibility. And she stopped then, not turning fully, only enough to acknowledge that she had heard him, her gaze shifting out across the open stretch beyond the last fence line, where the land rolled quiet and wide under the fading sky. And for a moment neither of them said anything more, because some spaces do not need to be filled. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm as before, but there was something softer beneath it now, not toward him, but toward the moment itself, saying that remembering was not the same as understanding, and that some places chose one without ever reaching the other. And Caleb let that settle without answering, because there was nothing in it that needed to be corrected or defended, only accepted for what it was. And after a few seconds, she turned her head, slightly more, just enough for him to see her expression clearly, not guarded, not distant, but resolved in a way that made everything else seem smaller by comparison. And she said that she had not come there to change anything, only to pass through, and that sometimes passing through was enough to reveal what had been there all along. And the words did not linger in the air the way others had. They moved with her, carried forward as she took another step beyond the reach of the town. And Caleb did not follow further, not because he could not, but because he understood that some distances were meant to remain, not as barriers, but as respect. And so he stopped where the dirt of the street gave way to the softer ground beyond, his eyes steady on the path she had chosen. And as the last light slipped down behind the ridge and the sky turned a deeper shade of evening, the figure of Elena Crow moved farther into that quiet expanse, not leaving something behind, but carrying something with her that the town had only just begun to see. And back in Red Creek, the people remained where they were, not watching her anymore, but standing in the space she had left behind, a space that no longer felt the same as it had before. And though no one said it aloud, the town itself had changed in a way that could not be undone, not because of who she was, but because of what they had chosen to see, and what they had finally been forced to understand. The town did not sleep easily that night, though no one would have admitted it if asked, because Red Creek had always carried itself like a place that knew its place in the world, steady, predictable, untouched by the kind of questions that unsettled a man when the sun went down. But something had shifted beneath that certainty, something quiet and persistent, and it showed itself in small ways, in the way doors closed a little slower, in the way conversations trailed off before reaching their usual conclusions, in the way a lantern left burning on a porch seemed to hold more attention than it should have, as if people were waiting for something that was no longer there. And Caleb sat outside the saloon long after the others had drifted away, his chair tipped back against the wall, hat low over his brow, watching the empty stretch of road where she had walked just hours before, and he could still see it, not her figure, but the space she had left behind. The absence that carried more presence than anything that had filled it earlier. And across the street the same men who had stood so certain now spoke in lower tones, their voices carrying fragments of thought rather than declarations. One of them saying that a badge did not change a person, another answering that maybe it was never meant to, and that exchange lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear, because it was not about the badge anymore, not really, it was about what they had revealed about themselves when they thought they already knew the truth. And further down the street the older man who had recognized the name Crow sat alone on the edge of the boardwalk, his hands resting on his knees, as if weighing something heavier than the day itself. And now and then he would glance toward the north ridge, not expecting to see anything, but unable to stop looking. And inside the saloon the barkeep wiped the same glass twice without realizing it, his mind somewhere else entirely, replaying the moment when certainty had slipped through his fingers without resistance. And even the boy who had spoken up earlier lay awake in his small room above the general store, staring at the ceiling as if trying to piece together why telling the truth had felt so much harder than staying quiet before, and all of it, every small shift, every quiet hesitation, traced back to the same place. The same moment when one person had stood in front of them and refused to become what they expected. And out beyond the edge of town the land stretched wide and open under a sky that had begun to fill with stars, the air cooler now, carrying the kind of stillness that did not belong to towns or voices. And somewhere along that stretch Elena Crow continued her path, her steps steady, unhurried, the rhythm of them matching something older than the roads behind her. And she did not look back, not because there was nothing to see, but because there was nothing left there that needed her to. And the badge rested once more beneath the fabric near her collar, hidden not out of fear, but because its purpose had already been served, not to prove who she was, but to reveal who they had been. And as she walked, the memory of the town did not weigh on her the way it might have once. It moved with her, lighter now, like a lesson that had already been learned and did not need to be carried heavily. And back in Red Creek the night settled deeper, the sounds growing fewer, the spaces between them wider, until even the wind seemed to move more carefully through the empty street. And though no one said it aloud, the town had begun to change in the only way that ever truly mattered, not through force, not through demand, but through the quiet understanding that once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. And somewhere in that understanding, in that long stretch of silence between what had been and what might be, Red Creek found itself standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. Not a person, not a story, but a truth that asked nothing from them except the willingness to see it. Morning came slow over Red Creek, not in light, but in awareness, the kind that settles into a place before the sun ever clears the ridge. And for the first time in a long while the town did not wake into its usual rhythm, it eased into it, like a man stepping carefully onto ground he no longer fully trusted. And the street that had carried so much certainty the day before now held something quieter. Something that did not announce itself, but could be felt in the way boots struck softer against the boards, in the way eyes met and then shifted away as if each person carried a piece of a thought they had not yet decided how to speak. And Caleb was already there before most of them, standing near the same post where he had first watched her, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze not searching, not expecting, just settled on the stretch of land beyond the town, as if that horizon had become something more than distance. And behind him the saloon door opened with its usual creak. But the sound felt different now, less like routine and more like interruption, and the barkeep stepped out, pausing longer than usual before speaking, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was choosing his words with a care he had never needed before, and he asked Caleb if she would come back. The question simple, but carrying more weight than it should have, and Caleb did not answer right away. Not because he did not know, but because the answer did not belong to him. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but softer than the day before, saying that some people do not come back to places that only learn after they leave. And the words settled into the morning air without resistance. And the barkeep nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in understanding, as if the truth of it did not need to be debated, only accepted. And further down the street, the older man stood again at the edge of the boardwalk, his gaze fixed on the same direction he had watched through the night. But now there was something different in it, not expectation, but reflection, like a man measuring the distance between what he had believed and what he now knew. And even the boy stepped out from the general store, his eyes scanning the road not for her return, but for something else, something harder to define. And in that quiet unfolding of morning, Red Creek did not become a different place all at once. It became aware of itself, aware of the way it had seen, the way it had judged, the way it had chosen ease over understanding. And that awareness did not shout. It did not demand change. It simply remained, steady and present, like a mark left in the dust that no wind could fully erase. And out beyond the town, miles past the last fence line, Elena Crow continued her path without pause, the land opening wide around her, the sky stretching endless above, and she moved with the same quiet certainty she had carried from the beginning, not faster, not slower, just forward. And somewhere along that stretch she reached up once more, her fingers brushing lightly against the place beneath her collar where the badge rested, not checking, not hiding, just acknowledging. And then her hand fell back to her side, because she no longer needed it, not for them, not for anyone. And the truth of who she was had never lived in that piece of metal. It had lived in the way she stood, the way she chose, the way she walked away without needing to prove anything at all. And back in Red Creek, the town carried on, the same buildings, the same road, the same people, but something in it had shifted just enough that it could not return to what it had been. And though no one marked the moment, no one spoke it aloud, it remained there in the space between them, in the pauses before words, in the questions that came slower but truer. And Caleb stood a while longer before finally turning away from the horizon, not because it no longer mattered, but because he understood that some things are not meant to be followed, only remembered. And as he walked back into the town that now felt slightly unfamiliar beneath his feet, the morning carried on, quiet and steady. And somewhere in that quiet, without ceremony, without declaration, Red Creek began the slow, uncertain work of seeing what it had once refused to see. And out on the open land, where no one was watching, Elena Crow disappeared into the distance, not as a story to be told, but as a truth that had already done what it came to do.